Forget the idea of a perfect happily ever after. For these couples, the honeymoon ended in broken vows sooner than anyone imagined. From a woman unknowingly honeymooning with a scammer to a couple's final selfie beside one of the world's most dangerous train streets. I'm Timothy, and welcome to Last Memories. It was on February 18, 2017, off the northeastern coast of Brazil, that a 27-year-old woman named Leanne Apostel discovered that the person she trusted most had been measuring her life in numbers on a policy document. Leanne grew up in Cebu City in the Philippines, working overnight shifts at an online travel agency. She had met a man named Rafael through a social media group. He presented himself as a coastal adventure guide, well-traveled and established. It's a crazy thought that after only 3 months of long-distance relationship, she married him in Manila and flew to Brazil 6 weeks later, selling jewelry inherited from her grandmother to help cover the visa process after Rafael claimed he would sponsor the rest of her travel expenses and submitted financial documents for her application. I've been blindly in love before, but even I could see the red flags in this one. Additionally, her family was not fully informed before she left. The photographs Rafael sent in the weeks before her departure showed him waving from harbor docks and dining at coastal restaurants, images she had shown her co-workers before boarding. The relationship moved fast, but if I were to be sympathetic to Leanne, I think reasoning is not hard to follow. Rafael appeared to offer something far removed from overnight call center work. He posted photographs beside boats and waterfalls, images her friends later identified as stolen from smaller online creators. The honeymoon was strange from the get-go. They moved through low-cost beach hostels, never staying anywhere long. On February 18th, Rafael arranged a private charter through a local fishing operation. The vessel was operated by Diego Tavares, 19, working his uncle's boat near Praia da Foca. Diego would become the only witness willing to talk. Diego said the water that morning was unsafe for standing passengers, with strong Atlantic swells hitting exposed rocks and spray reaching above the rail. He warned Rafael, but Rafael ignored him, pushed Leanne to the outer rail for photos, and pressured Diego to move closer to the surf zone. Diego tried to hold position outside the break, but repeated demands, and the current gradually carried the boat closer than intended. A wave struck at one point, nearly knocking Leanne over. Diego told both to sit down, and Rafael laughed. By the time they were roughly 12 yards from a rock channel, a larger swell hit. Diego said Rafael moved behind Leanne as the boat rolled, grabbed her shoulder, and shoved her hard enough that she struck the rail and lost her footing on the wet deck, going over backward. Diego immediately cut the motor. A flotation ring was within reach, but Rafael did not throw it. Instead, he turned to Diego, offered him money to stay silent and not assist, and threatened him. Diego, 19, was left alone on the water with a man who had just thrown a passenger overboard and was standing between him and the rescue equipment. She had no way to know about the 2 life insurance policies taken out after the marriage through a small brokerage using forged residency records and stolen identities attached as co-signers. Investigators later found that several names attached to the paperwork had been linked to previous insurance irregularities months before Leanne arrived in Brazil. She trusted someone she had known for 3 months, and that trust was the only tool he needed. I don't know how Diego stayed functional in those seconds. Diego later told police he tried to reach for the flotation ring twice before Rafael stepped in front of it. He went in anyway. The current took her toward the rock channel fast. Diego described watching her head contact stone at least twice before whitewater closed over her. When she resurfaced, blood was visible around her hairline before the foam carried it apart. He fought the surge for several minutes before reaching her. Rafael never entered the water. She was pulled out roughly 9 minutes after going in. Diego radioed emergency services from the water. Responders arrived approximately 24 minutes later. She was unconscious with severe cranial injuries and died before reaching a clinic. The coroner's findings were direct. Blunt force trauma to the posterior and lateral skull consistent with repeated contact against rough stone. Seawater aspiration indicating she was breathing when she went under. Cranial injury was listed as the primary cause of death. Aspiration as contributing. Raphael gave a statement to police 3 days after the incident and disappeared. Investigators connected him to a pattern involving other foreign women and insurance arrangements that did not hold up to scrutiny. The case stalled after Diego, the primary witness, stopped responding, reportedly following threats believed to be connected to Raphael. Authorities later lost contact with him. Leanne's mother buried her in Cebu and was in debt after the expenses of the burial and repatriation. I get that her decision was also practical. Raphael had offered an exit from her paycheck to paycheck life and a future that looked brighter than anything Leanne could build alone, and that made the risk feel like a chance. Now the next one is not a scam. It's about a couple, 2 scooters, and a single uphill corner that neither of them should have taken. It was July 3rd, 2015, on a 2-lane coastal road through Kathu district in Phuket province, Thailand. A stretch of asphalt that had no business being treated like a racetrack. But that's exactly what 2 newlyweds decided to make it. Tarek Hadi, 31, was an appliance repair technician from Amman, Jordan. His wife Salma, 29, taught chemistry at a private secondary school. Friends described them as intensely competitive travelers who planned every trip themselves and kept a running record of countries visited. Thailand was their honeymoon, planned entirely on their own terms. The decision to rent separate scooters rather than share one makes sense if you know them. Based on what I've read, they were 2 people with that temperament who did not ride one behind the other. They spent most of the afternoon side by side along coastal roads outside the main beach district, both wearing helmet-mounted cameras, accelerating together in matched bursts. They were doing exactly what they always did, in a place where the margin was far thinner than they measured. By early evening, the road back toward the main district had thickened with vehicles, the flow of traffic turning uneven and hesitant as scooters, vans, and small passenger cars merged into the same narrow stretch. A small modified tour bus towing a low luggage trailer moved ahead of them. The trailer stacked with suitcases, tied down with fraying straps, and riding visibly low as it bounced over patched asphalt. A delivery driver who later spoke to police said he had been watching Tarek's scooter for several minutes, weaving left, pulling back, then edging forward again to probe blind uphill corners where visibility disappeared into the bend. Salma stayed close behind, maintaining a cautious distance but never fully breaking off. Now, if you know this street, you would slow down instinctively because the road beside the food stalls had narrowed to barely 1 lane in each direction. The afternoon light had already gone flat under heavy cloud cover when the bus driver signaled and pulled out to pass a slower vehicle ahead, committing to the overtake without much clearance. At the exact same moment, Tarek accelerated into the opposite lane in an attempt to pass both vehicles before the road curved sharply uphill and visibility collapsed again beyond the bend. Neither saw the other's move in time to correct. The front corner of the bus struck his scooter at a shallow angle, and the impact was not dramatic in sound or motion. It was fast, clipped, almost understated, but it was immediately irreversible. The scooter was knocked sideways, its balance gone instantly, and Tarek's body went left and down beneath the line of the trailer wheels. A security camera on a nearby pharmacy captured what followed. Tarek's scooter disappeared beneath the chassis, and the rear axle passed over his lower body. Witnesses visible in the footage stopped mid-step on the sidewalk. One man dropped what he was carrying. There was no distinguishable dramatic sound. Just the bus continuing forward while the crowd began to process what had happened before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Salma's helmet camera footage, recovered and reviewed by traffic investigators, showed her swerving right. She caught the trailer with her left side, jaw and neck striking exposed steel framing at speed before she flipped forward headfirst onto the road beside the debris. Witnesses at the roadside described her convulsing near the wreckage. Tarek, partially trapped beneath the stopped bus, was conscious and audible. Bystanders responded immediately. Several tourists applied pressure to his abdomen using beach towels, rainwater mixed with fuel and blood across the asphalt. Emergency calls came within seconds of impact. Ambulances took approximately 40 minutes to arrive through holiday traffic. A provincial medical examiner's report noted that Tarek sustained crushing pelvic and lower torso injuries with massive internal hemorrhage. He died during surgery that night. Salma suffered severe facial fractures, cervical trauma, and irreversible brain swelling, consistent with a high-velocity cranial impact. She died in intensive care 2 days later after rapid neurological deterioration. In the end, what haunts me most isn't their recklessness. It's the tragic precision with which two people who lived life on their own terms ended it the same way, never once doubting the road would bend to their will. And maybe that's the cruelest lesson here. Some margins don't care how much you love each other or how many countries you've conquered. Next story wasn't fast. A couple made it all the way to India on a 2-year savings dream, and then something as ordinary as a cheap meal took everything apart. It was November 12, 2014, on the Ganges riverfront in Varanasi. Two newlyweds had done everything right. Spreadsheets, budget forecasts, months of shift breaks spent watching backpacking videos. They were careful in the way that only people who have very little margin can afford to be. And somewhere between a $30 clinic visit and a locked door, careful stopped mattering. Chao Yue was 25 and Lin Yue was 24. They worked at the same electronics components plant in a factory town outside Wuhan, married the previous spring, and had saved for nearly 2 years toward a budget honeymoon through northern India. The trip was modest by design. Cheap guest houses, street food, no room for error. I think even you could see that every measure they could control, they had prepared. However, in India, there was no margin. A regional rail disruption voided their prepaid tickets early in the journey, forcing replacement transport at 3 times the budgeted cost. And by the time they reached Varanasi with 9 days remaining, they were surviving on street food and roadside bottled water, managing what little was left toward a return flight that was already paid. 3 days before their scheduled departure, they bought paneer curry from a stall in a narrow alley near the Ghat, one of dozens of identical stalls along that block. Both developed vomiting and diarrhea within hours. The guest house owner was notified by another guest, knocked, and suggested a nearby private clinic. The estimated upfront cost was roughly $30. They declined. He did not call anyone. The owner later stated that the man expected the illness to resolve on its own. Varanasi's alley guest houses are packed tightly enough that sound carries through shared walls without effort. Other guests described hearing near-constant retching through the nights of November 9th and 10th. By November 11th, a German traveler staying 2 doors down later said that Chow had appeared in the corridor looking disoriented, asked him what day it was, and then walked back toward the room after receiving an answer. The traveler did not alert staff, which I have a bone to pick with. Does it really hurt to care a little? Security footage from the corridor camera, later reviewed by local authorities, showed Chow leaving the room shortly after 4:10 a.m., barefoot, visibly unsteady, and using the wall for support. He moved approximately 15 feet before his knees gave out. He sat against the wall for several minutes, then slowly crawled back. He eventually made his way back into the room. No staff were in the corridor at that hour. The housekeeper assigned to that floor arrived around noon, following her usual rounds of checking occupied rooms and preparing departures on a quiet, procedural schedule. She said that she knocked several times in a standard pattern, received no response from inside, and after a brief pause of uncertainty, used the master key provided by the front desk to enter. Lynn was on the near mattress, completely unresponsive and lying in a position that suggested no recent movement. The bedding around her was heavily contaminated with dried vomit and fecal matter. The fabric stiffened and stained in multiple layers that indicated this had not happened recently but had been left unattended for some time. Chow was on the floor beside the bed, still alive but visibly deteriorated, eyes deeply sunken into their sockets, lips cracked and pale with dehydration, breathing rapid, shallow, and clearly audible in the otherwise silent room. She called down to the front desk immediately, her voice breaking the standard report procedure and shifting into urgent alarm as she relayed what she was seeing. I genuinely don't know what to do with that image, or how to properly process what that kind of scene represents when it is described so plainly. The owner placed the call to emergency services and ambulance arrived more than 40 minutes later because Varanasi was midway through a major religious festival, and the riverfront roads were largely impassable with pedestrian and vehicle traffic. Lynn was pronounced dead at the scene. Chow suffered cardiac arrest during transport and could not be revived. The medical review determined both deaths resulted from acute gastroenteritis leading to severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, compounded by roughly 2 days without medical intervention. Cases like this are often survivable with timely rehydration and electrolyte treatment. Due to their frugality, neither received any treatment at any point. The guest house quietly renumbered the room after online travel forums began discussing the deaths. The alley stall continued operating. I think there is no clean way to assign fault and move past this. The owner made a judgment call. The neighboring traveler answered a question and went back to his room. The clinic had a cost that functioned, for those two people in that moment, as a wall. Now, consider a different honeymoon nightmare. Not one where a couple refused medical help, but one where a woman refused to hand over her bag. It was September 21st, 2018, in the Maboneng district of Johannesburg, South Africa. Just past midnight, the city's hum had dropped to something quieter and less forgiving. Mirelle Bakker was 30 years old and worked the front desk of a veterinary clinic in the Netherlands. Her wife, Kaya, was 28 and spent her days restoring antique furniture alongside her father. They had chosen Johannesburg for their honeymoon, not for safaris or resort towns, but because Kaya wanted to photograph abandoned industrial buildings and open-air night markets. By all accounts, they were grounded, practical people who had saved for over a year for this trip. They had spent part of the evening at a small bar in the district known among travelers for being welcoming to LGBTQ couples. Staff there would later tell investigators that before the two left, they were warned directly, more than once, not to walk back to their rental loft past midnight. If you've been to Maboneng, you would know that the blocks between the bar and their building were known locally for late-night robberies and muggings. However, they walked anyway. I find myself thinking about those staff members. They did everything right, warned them clearly, and still had to live with what followed. That decision does not make what happened the victim's fault, but it is the decision that put them on that street. The neighborhood at that hour had the particular stillness of a place that functions on a different rhythm after dark. CCTV footage recovered later showed the two women walking at a normal pace, bags over their shoulders, moving with the easy confidence of people who believed the distance was manageable. The same footage shows two men falling in behind them within 60 seconds of appearing in the same CCTV corridor after they left the bar. They followed for nearly 4 minutes, close enough to maintain sight, far enough to avoid drawing attention. The confrontation happened beside a partially closed auto repair garage. One of the men produced a revolver and handed their phones and bags. Kaya surrendered hers immediately. However, her wife had a different thing in mind. Morel shoved one attacker hard enough to knock him off balance and immediately followed through by striking him with a heavy metal water bottle she had been carrying, likely using it as a blunt object in a desperate attempt to create distance. I'm reading this, screaming internally about her plan against a gun, because no improvised defense changes the fundamental imbalance in that kind of confrontation. Her movements were fast, reactive, and driven by panic rather than any coherent strategy, which is often how these moments actually unfold when someone realizes too late what they are up against. Witnesses in apartments above the street later told police they heard shouting coming up from below, followed by a brief and unsettling silence. That pause was then broken by 3 gunshots in quick succession, sharp enough to cut through walls and glass and leave no ambiguity about what had just escalated outside. Kaya was struck first, in the chest. She collapsed against a parked hatchback and did not get up. Morel had been shot through the abdomen and kept moving. Security footage showed her attempting to drag Kaya behind the vehicle while visibly losing blood. One attacker fired again at near point-blank range into Morel's shoulder and neck. Both men fled on foot. A restaurant employee working a late shift heard the shots and called emergency services. Kaya was declared dead at the scene. The medical examiner noted catastrophic internal bleeding from the chest wound, involving major vascular and cardiac structures, making survival unlikely without immediate surgical intervention. Morel was conscious and speaking in the ambulance. She underwent multiple surgeries, but died 3 days later in intensive care after developing multi-organ failure and acute respiratory complications following extensive trauma and surgical intervention. Police identified both suspects through overlapping CCTV footage and cell phone records and recovered surveillance footage tied to the stolen devices. Both were arrested 6 weeks later and later sentenced to life imprisonment for double murder and armed robbery. Most armed robberies do not escalate beyond the handover. I am not saying Morel was wrong to fight. The instinct to protect someone you love is not something you reason your way out of in a moment like that. But possessions can be replaced. The outcome here is a reminder, as brutal as any, that they almost never can be. Despite being warned, they didn't see the danger. But unlike them, these next newlyweds saw all the red flags and still went green. It was May 28, 2016, above a remote stretch of Tara Canyon in northern Montenegro. Efron and Dita weren't tourists. Tourists follow signs. They followed a whisper, a local post about a canyon zipline no authority knew existed. Efron Vala was 33 and his wife Dita was 31. Together, they had built a deliberate habit of seeking adventure outside organized channels, drawn specifically to experiences that felt unfiltered and unpackaged, according to friends. It had likely worked often enough that the pattern had stopped feeling like a risk. Now, based on reports, they were in Montenegro on their honeymoon when a social media post from a local operator advertising a private canyon zipline run caught their attention. The post positioned it as exclusive, something off any official registry or tourism listing. Efron reportedly wanted to ride tandem. Now the setup was completely unlicensed and had never been inspected by any authority. Photographs recovered during the investigation showed anchor bolts drilled into fractured limestone with visible micro-cracking and edge spalling around the drill sites, consistent with over-torque installation in degraded rock, and mismatched climbing hardware sourced secondhand. The cable stretched across a gorge section nearly 300 feet above rocks and fast-moving river flow. A welded steel trolley served as the carrier. There was no load calculation performed on site, no written briefing, and no formal weight assessment before both of them clipped in together, and no redundant safety line or secondary arrest system was present anywhere on the span. Now I'm no expert, but that looks like an absolute recipe for disaster. A backpacker named Costin had arrived to watch from the launch side. When Efron and Dita stepped off the platform together, the trolley moved cleanly for the first several seconds. Then, roughly at the midpoint of the span, witnesses reported a progressive change in cable tone, described as rapid metallic pinging consistent with anchor stress redistribution. Costin later described what he heard as a sequence of sharp metallic snapping sounds, not a single break, but several in close succession, like hardware giving up incrementally under load. One primary anchor point pulled out of the limestone entirely after progressive rock fracture expansion. Costin said he saw the line dropping unevenly and whipping laterally across the gorge, with the trolley accelerating violently as tension redistributed across the remaining span. A secondary clamp in the rigging failed moments later under sudden shock loading, fracturing at the connection point rather than shattering cleanly. Both Efron and Dita were still partially secured by sections of harness and cable when they fell free during the system collapse phase. The footage recorded them striking the canyon wall during uncontrolled pendulum motion rather than a single vertical drop. The sound of final impact carried through the gorge and was heard by a group of rafters on the river below. The rafters reached the site approximately 11 minutes after hearing distress calls and shouting from above the canyon rim. Mountain rescue arrived roughly 50 to 60 minutes later due to limited access routes. The medical examiner determined both victims sustained unsurvivable trauma consistent with high-energy blunt force impacts against irregular rock surfaces, including severe cranial fractures, multiple complex limb fractures, and catastrophic internal injuries. Neither survived the initial impacts. The operator disappeared before police arrived. Investigators found he had been formally warned about illegal adventure setups before and had continued advertising through temporary social media accounts under rotating identities. He was later arrested and charged with 2 counts of criminally negligent homicide. And it's hard not to sit with the uncomfortable reality that this wasn't some unpredictable twist of nature, but a preventable failure built from ignored warnings, skipped oversight, and pure improvisation. What lingers most is how easily exclusive and off-the-books marketing can turn into a final decision no one gets to undo. But our last couple didn't need a shady guide. They ignored clear warnings all on their own. It was December 9, 2019, in a narrow residential lane in the Hoan Kiem district of Hanoi, Vietnam, where tourists had learned to treat a live rail corridor as a photo opportunity rather than a hazard. The Baron couple was no different. Ilya Baron was 26 years old and worked remotely as a freelance IT contractor based in Leipzig, Germany. Nadine Baron, also 26 and his wife of fewer than 2 weeks, was midway through a dental assistant training program at a vocational institute in the same city. They had chosen Hanoi specifically for their honeymoon after seeing the rail lane featured in international travel forums. Photographs of trains threading through residential corridors with tourists standing close enough to feel the gust of wind. The couple arrived during late afternoon when residents along the corridor had already begun moving tourists away from the tracks. A northbound train was due, and the people who lived on that lane knew the schedule and clearance the way someone knows the reach of a tool they use every day. Several vendors gestured the Barons back from the rail. Nadine stepped away briefly. Ilya moved her closer again, adjusting her position relative to the tracks. This is documented in witness statements, the two visible in the lane, Ilya repositioning Nadine along the gravel margin, the gap between her and the rail narrowing across multiple frames. Locals later described both of them as dismissive of the warnings. You have to understand that the locals weren't being cautious. They were being exact. They knew the clearance. The Barons did not. The footage also captured the period just before the train arrived. The horn sounded in intermittent, escalating blasts as the locomotive closed the final bend before the lane. Residents who recognized the sequence moved into doorways without hesitation. Several called out to the couple again. One resident later told investigators she shouted at them in both Vietnamese and English to move. The horn continued in repeated bursts as the train came into full view around the bend. Vendors who had lingered near the lane pressed back against exterior walls. The couple remained at the rail margin. The locomotive emerged from the bend at a heavily reduced speed appropriate for the residential corridor. Not unusually fast, but fast enough that the bend had hidden the approach until it was already close. Nadine turned away from the tracks. She slipped on the loose gravel at the rail margin. Ilya reached for her arm and caught it, but the motion disrupted his own footing. A street vendor watching from a door frame roughly 30 feet away later described both of them going down nearly together. Not dramatically, the way people fall when balance is already compromised and something sudden shifts beneath them. The locomotive struck them within moments of the fall as it reached their position along the track edge. Nadine was thrown laterally into a concrete exterior wall. The impact was instantaneous. Ilya was caught beneath the side of the train and pushed a short distance along the corridor surface before the locomotive cleared the corridor. Multiple witnesses later described him moving in the seconds after, pushing at the ground with his arms despite catastrophic lower body injuries. He remained briefly conscious. No one moved toward the rail until the train had fully passed. I genuinely couldn't read those witness statements about Ilya trying to lift himself without stopping for a while. I don't think I'll forget that part. Nadine was confirmed dead at the scene by emergency services. Ilya was alive when loaded but died before reaching the hospital. The medical examiner's report recorded Nadine's cause of death as massive cranial and cervical trauma consistent with high-velocity impact against a fixed concrete surface. Ilya's cause of death was recorded as catastrophic traumatic lower limb injury with fatal hemorrhagic shock, blood loss incompatible with survival, without immediate surgical intervention. Residents along the lane gave statements in the days that followed. The consistent thread across all of them was not grief, though some expressed that it was frustration. They had called out, gestured, and pointed. They understood the clearance because they lived beside it every day. Several said the couple had been warned repeatedly and stayed regardless. Now, this lane wasn't a controlled attraction or a protected viewpoint. It was a working rail corridor that happened to be visually interesting. I think the deeper issue here is how easily infrastructure meant for function gets rebranded into something people start treating like a curated experience.